And that means that other people during the week, should they choose, will be able to access this. Are other people there, Andy, on your side?
Just a 15-year-old son.
Oh, he's going to sit in on this.
Well, he'd really like to. I'm sure he wants to know what's going on in the 1300s and how his phone works. I mean,
Yeah.
the mechanism of the clock is foundational in understanding your phone.
Everything.
Yeah, everything. Yeah.
Everything. That's right.
I'm looking forward to it. The readings were great this week. Thanks, Joe. This is great.
Very good. So, welcome. I am Joe Luff, and this is the Theology of Karl Marx. For those of you accessing this seminar online, we will be meeting every Sunday for the next 7 weeks at 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time in the C. Robbins Clark Library at St. Mark's Episcopal Church in Berkeley. If you missed last week's seminar, you will find a link in the syllabus online. You will need a passcode to view it. To obtain the passcode, email me at firstname.lastname joseph.luff@gmail.com. Seminars will be mastered and posted on the course website as soon after each session as I can put them together. For those who need assistance as accessing the seminar, you can email me at josephluff@gmail.com. So last week we took notice of divine materiality, God's presence in time and space in things, and of a creation where human and non-human members of the community share in one another's joys, sorrows, and in one another's hopes. And I don't know about you, but I pray the Psalms every day, and I'm just always struck by how deeply material the Psalms are, and their references to the natural universe and God's interest in the natural universe and in animals and in all the things that happen here. In the ecumenical creeds, we noticed a non-dualistic God whose incarnation, suffering, and death, far from concealing, instead reveal God's true nature, which remains spatially and temporally inflected even following the Lord's ascension and glorification. In its fully elaborated form, in part 3 of St. Thomas's Summa Theologica, we took note of how different St. Thomas's problem and the problem of his readers was to our own problem. Aquinas's readers found God present in more than the Church's 7 official sacraments. A century later, many Christians could not imagine God's material presence anywhere. This week, we examine the collection of circumstances that brought Christians to question and ultimately reject divine materiality. So first, is there anything that struck you as novel or wrong-headed or questionable in this week's readings or last week's readings? Okay, Fran is going to read them sometime. So less than 3 centuries after the composition of St. Thomas's Summa, half of Western Christendom would come to disavow the spiritual value of things. In large numbers, they would deny the capacity of material things to contain or transmit divine grace. Now, this is a theological problem, but it is also a social scientific problem because it raises a question about what and how people experience value. What do Christians value? Well, in the 13th century, they valued things. In the 16th century, they did not. And it's worth asking why. The Chinese escapement entered Christian Europe by way of Muslim Andalusia. Muslim prayers, like Jewish prayers, are calibrated to lunar, not solar cycles. The equal units of abstract time measured out by the escapement was for this reason of no use to them. Yet, as the rule of St. Benedict spread north into regions with ever less sunlight in winter and ever lower temperatures, traditional means of measuring abstract time were of less and less value. Abstract time was essential if Frère Jacques and Sœur Jacqueline were to awaken their community members to prayer. Sundials were useless, ropes and candles were unreliable, water clocks froze, especially during Europe's mini ice age. Thus, the value of the escapement, especially in communities of prayer, and actually nowhere else. The rhythms of daily life for all communities was governed by what anthropologists call variable time. The rising and setting of the sun, the seasons, the tides, hence lunar cycles, menses, human and non-human, migrations, again, both human and non-human, and so on. In only one context, that of prayer, Christian prayer, not Muslim prayer or Jewish prayer, did Western Europeans measure human practice around equal units of abstract time. 7 times, 4 of these during the night when non-cloistered communities were not obligated to pray. Nevertheless, as Benedictine practice spread, so too did the escapement, and soon everyone within earshot of a cloister was awakened at all hours of the night for prayer, even those who did not have to pray. Now, we are not inclined to pay much attention to daily rhythms. Alarms awaken us. We make appointments. We keep dates. We're not desperate to put our children, we are desperate to put our children on a normal schedule within months of their birth, something that eventually, I promise you, happens, which makes the tension between variable or natural time and abstract time palpable. Abstract time graded against normal time, natural time. This was the sort of time we read about last week, set by God in creation, when the moon ruled the night and the sun ruled the day, when God placed these rhythms in the dome above as signs, except for those called to prayer. Abstract time is not divine time. Abstract time is the opposite of divine time. So Benedictine hours were like a gnat or a mosquito, inconsequential to all but those who must pray, but a genuine nuisance to those who do not. Yet there it was, filling the countryside, wherever the Benedictines established themselves, which was everywhere, suggesting an alternative to variable time, which it did from roughly 1000 CE in what was then culturally, scientifically, technologically, and politically the most backward region on the planet. That would be Western Europe. Now, both David Landis and Jacques Le Goff place prayer at the center of their accounts. What is odd is that Christian scholars do not. For Christian scholars, Daily rhythms are thrust into the background. Thought and doctrine are thrust forward. But what if the shift from the affirmation of divine materiality to its renunciation had less to do with what people thought than with what people heard and what people did? What Le Goff and Landis suggest is that Christians over time became inured to abstract time and abstract value, and that more than anything else, this practical experiential shift in value made them open to experiencing divine value differently. Now, think about your own daily rhythms. To meet my commute, I awaken well before 6 every day. Because my spouse works with global partners, she often awakens at 4. Diurnal rhythms are entirely foreign to me, which may explain my impatience with people in the checkout line or at the gas station who appear to be entirely oblivious to what time it is. Anyone who has crossed the border from Switzerland to Italy knows what I'm talking about. All of the trains run on time, then suddenly they do not. And suddenly hours posted on storefronts have no meaning. But we must be careful. The Benedictine monks were not aiming at abstract time or value. They were observing hours of prayer. Their bells were not directed outward towards the community, they were directed inward. That their bells were also noticed by Christians beyond cloistered walls could scarcely be avoided. It was not their aim to play God, it was their aim to play human beings. Now, this is not to say that in other respects, cloistered brothers and sisters were above pecuniary interests. Cloisters needed to maintain themselves, and they did so plying the widest range of trades. And I mean by that the widest range. Some became quite wealthy, if by wealth we mean things and political influence. A not uncommon trope holds that modern capitalism was the child of material wealth. This trope is particularly common among those who study Europe. Capitalism emerged out of the material wealth generated by Mediterranean trade. It would be more accurate to say that modern capitalism was the stepchild of material wealth. Without the fortunes of the Mediterranean merchants and financial houses, the demand for goods produced in Northern and Western Europe would never have achieved the fevered pitch they did in the 13th and 14th centuries. Nevertheless, without the escapement, this fevered pitch would have flattened out. In other words, it would have reached its material limit. And here's why. And I'm going to share my screen here if I can. Share. There. Can you see this, Andy?
Yes, sir, I can. Thank you so much.
Great. Wonderful. Remember, for 10 years, I taught economic theory and history at UC Berkeley. And occasionally I was roped into teaching the ginormous Econ 2 lecture for econ majors. It was in this lecture that I was introduced to an old formula, MPL equals delta Q over delta L. So that's the marginal product of labor over the change in a quantity, any quantity, and the change in labor. And And that could also be the change in capital. Capital and labor are what is called differentially related below the line. So this explains why no amount of material wealth will ever give rise to capitalism. This is what it looks like in Robin Wells and Paul Krugman's familiar textbook. So what does this formula measure? Not an increase in wealth, not an increase in labor, nor even an increase in things. It measures whether an enterprise is producing more with less. But more what? Not more things, but more value. But what is value? Value is a ratio, delta Q over delta L. A change in quantity over a change in labor, or capital N labor. So plotted linearly, it looks like this, and you see that on the screen. And you'll notice what's critical here is not the volume, but the change. Right? You could be producing more, but if you're producing more with more, then that doesn't help you. You could be producing less with much less, and that increases your marginal product. So it's not the volume of things, it's the marginal product. But there's a missing variable here. It is not provided, it's more assumed. That missing variable is time. And it is implied by the delta, the change, which in mathematics signifies change. So long as investors are investing in material wealth, in things, they will always reach a limit that is characteristic of things. You can think of it this way. How many pairs of shoes can you fit in your closet? Or in all conceivable closets? Eventually, you run out of room because that's the nature of things. Now, think about how much abstract value you can fit into these closets. Insofar as it is abstract, value takes up no space. It is limitless. More with less. More things for less time, more abstract time, or more marginal value for less time and less capital. So examine Mediterranean commerce as much as you like. It will never give rise to abstract time, value, and labor. When the good abbot of Saint-Pierre in Ghent moved his clock from the chapel to the workhouse in 1324, he replaced the substantive value of the textiles produced in his workhouse with the abstract value of the marginal product of labor. A clothes maker could purchase a bolt of fabric. The clothes maker would then own the fabric. Or that same clothes maker could instead purchase the labor time of men, women, and children who produce that fabric. They would then produce not fabric, but abstract value. The key here is not the labor. Right? Many social theorists, social scientists, many Marxists will say, well, this is the labor theory of value. Kind of. Things have always been produced by labor, though. The key is abstract time. By reducing labor to abstract time, investors gain command over something far more valuable than its product. They gain command over its marginal product. Now, Northern and Western Europe embraced abstract time, abstract labor, and abstract value much earlier than their much wealthier Southern neighbors, who remained fixated on material wealth. This is sometimes framed as the mercantile crisis, where some nations, Spain, Italy, the Habsburgs, and Portugal, hoarded things and specie, that is gold and silver, while others plowed ahead, refining industry and trade. But another way to conceptualize the mercantile crisis is that it reflects two very different understandings of what value is and where value is. Yes, Fran?
No, the question, I'm just thinking.
Yeah, okay. The fact is that within 2 centuries, nations that valued things were left in the dust by Belgium, the Netherlands, and by England. But let me put this same point in a slightly different way. Next week, we're going to look closely at the fates of the Virgin Mary's body and the body of her divine Son. Northern and Western Europe, the home of abstract time, value, and labor, were the first also to recognize that the bodies of the Holy Mother and of her Son had no value. They were the first to recognize that their real value was abstract and immaterial. Bodies that have no value. Value that has no body. So we see this divergence already in the 14th century. So before moving on to Moishe Pistone, I'm wondering whether anybody has any observations or questions or wants to point out other things that were of significance. This is a very high-level gloss on Landis and Le Goff.
This is moving well. I'm intrigued. I mean, there are some parts and pieces that I'd love to dig into, but would love for you to finish out this and see how you integrated the remainder of it, and then what you're saying. As I mentioned last week, this is quite different from how I've learned about time, value, bodies, etc. So this is very intriguing. So I'm on the edge of my seat.
Okay, very good. Yeah, well, if at any point you see something or want to dig deeper, feel free. So in his discussion of abstract time, Moishe Pistone points out several pitfalls to avoid in our research. First, we need to distinguish between abstract and variable time. Abstract time in the sense used in physics or rigorous mathematical modeling simply did not exist prior to the 14th century. So time in this sense emerged within time, constituted differently, constituted practically. So our very experience of time emerged within practical time. And it's sometimes presented, particularly by historians, as the opposite. There is this empty, continuous continuum of equal units of time in which events take place. rather than the events themselves generating how we experience time. Abstract time is constituted, but it is experienced and used as though it were an independent variable. It is experienced and used as though it is the objective world in which we live. No, it isn't. Yeah. So we should not think of abstract time primarily as a technical advance. The escapement was initially calibrated to measure variable events, processes, etc. 0 hour, which emerged quite late, was unknown. So once the sun sets, we don't need to measure time any longer. Once the sun rises, we can start measuring time again. And it was only for cloistered monks that the in-between hours had any significance. But they didn't have the significance of 0 hour to 24 hours. They had the significance of times of prayer. Abstract time was developed less to measure the value of labor than as a product of such measurement. Work had been measured with natural time, daily bread, daily wage. Right? Workers heatedly contested the shift to abstract time. They thought they were being cheated. Right? Abstract time constitutes the values of commodities. Abstract time is composed by labor, which is itself constituted as a commodity that constitutes its own measure as a quasi-independent variable. That's kind of crucial, that prior to human beings constituting themselves in abstract terms and their value in abstract terms, we have people who are members of trades who do a specific concrete kind of labor and produce specific concrete kinds of things, but we don't have labor constituting its own abstract value. And that abstract value strikes laborers as something outside of them and beyond and independent from their own action. Abstract time selects for specific kinds of social action. We know for certain that human beings built devices that took human beings to and sustained them as they walked on and returned from the moon. To achieve this feat required extraordinarily precise temporal measurements. That's not fictitious, it's real. Time in that sense was extremely helpful. But I would argue our interest in going to the moon would never have taken place as it did were abstract time not intimately bound to commodity production and exchange. So once you get to the point of using time as a vehicle to get to the moon and back, you're already within a society that is entirely mediated by abstract time, for which natural time has, for all practical purposes, ceased to exist. So I should mention before pausing that Pistone was a devout Jew. He was the son of a rabbi. And it is therefore significant that he categorically denies Christianity's role in constituting abstract time. Whatever responsibility we want to lay at the feet of the abbot of Saint-Pierre, his decision was not theological. But this is not to say that it did not have theological ramifications. Labor constitutes an abstract category that appears to enjoy independence from that labor, and which in turn determines the value of that labor. Time is, in this sense, bent, it is narrowed and constrained to exclude and to denigrate variable time. Right? We enter a universe where things that are temporal, spatial, material cannot be divine by definition. Which obviously will have huge ramifications for what we think we're saying when we say the creed, or how we read Genesis, or how we read Romans, or Thomas, or what we think we're doing when we are receiving the sacraments. So, what else? That I think captures a lot of this, but probably not all of it. Anything else?
In this portion, I wrote in my notes on the reading, I wish somebody could do an etymology of how we greeted one another. When did it shift to "how are you being" to "how are you doing"? It's, it's an interesting, because all of recognizing one another as human beings instead of human doings. I think it has a lot to do with time. Lately, especially after COVID, I don't know if you've experienced this in your emergence after lockdown social life, but I used to ask the question, what do you do when you're not at this dinner party? Or how do you spend your days when we're not at this meeting? Or those kinds of things. Trying to get, or even asking the question, do you work outside the home? All of those questions now have a very different outcome than they did before COVID. So now I'm more prone to ask, how is it with you? Instead of what are you working on, or what do you do? I used to define people by work, and now out of sheer inclusivity, I've decided to make a shift in maybe in my own faith tradition, moving back to the United Methodist or the Methodist founder, John Wesley, where his quintessential question was, how is it with your soul? Is there a contemporary take on that where we're actually engaging a person's being rather than their doing? So that's what came up for me in this last part of the reading, and I'm glad you raised it, because it does shape the way we see our neighbors dramatically. Does this person have value outside of this dinner party? That's a real challenging, that's a deeply theological problem. If we were to believe that every person and non-person has value, and then to categorize it just in a simple greeting is fascinating to me. So I know that Fran's in the room, so I'm not going to take up all of our time on this, but it's just an observation that that floated through that I've been living with throughout the week.
Interesting. Can I push that a little bit?
Absolutely.
If time is constituted by doing, as to say, the time of the fisher will be different than the time of the thresher, or the time of the tanner, or the time of the builder. There's the time it takes to get from home to church. There's the time of prayer. There are all these windows of time, all these envelopes of time that are discrete and not necessarily overlapping. It is, for me, therefore, not surprising that human beings prior to capitalism have identities that are strictly circumscribed not only by who they are, but by what they do, and those two are intimately related. I, as a peasant, will never have blue blood pumping through my veins, and there's nothing that I can do short of marriage to make that so. And even then, I will probably always be considered an interloper because I don't have a blood relative on the throne. That will change with abstract time and value, where my value as a human being is unrelated to my body. And unrelated to what I do. All people are created equal, right? Except quite clearly in their bodies, they are not. And so long as I claim that that's the case before the law, do I really have to make it so in terms of their bodies? Probably not. Later on, we don't look at Wesley as such, but we will definitely look at the awakening movement, and it is a critical dimension of the awakening movement that the old lights and the old forms are obsolete. The old hymns, the old forms of worship. Bodies that change cannot be divine, which I think is going to be a serious problem, because then change itself becomes tainted as a non-divine category, right? And then we're only then steps away from the cosmic Christ and Teilhard de Chardin.
Right. Exactly. The
Palestinian Jew is gone.
Fascinating.
Brand is making all sorts of noises here, but
But a tiger by the tail.
yeah. Is there anything else? Well, I'm guessing that people will log in later when this is not synchronous, not at the same time. Do invite others to join us for next week, when we will be considering the fates of bodies deprived of value, principally the body of the Holy Virgin and her divine Son, but also the fate of suffered by sacred mirth, by laughter, which changes demonstrably towards the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the modern era. And that's sort of the embodiment of folks who occupy the streets and the pubs and who experience God principally on feast days and at Carnival. And that will change dramatically after the 14th century. So I hope you can join us. Thank you very much, Andy, for your faithful attendance here. Thank you, Fran.
Yeah, thank you both. It's I'm really appreciating this and appreciate the accountability on Sunday afternoon as well.
Yeah, very good.
Great.
Thanks.